If you're anything like me, you've probably seen both Top Gun movies several times and probably memorized some of it. And they did a great job of chronicling aircrew going through Top Gun and their subsequent combat action. But in the most recent movie, did you wonder what Maverick did as a test pilot in the desert before he ejected at Mach 10? This series will help, and hopefully so will I. My name is Brian Sinclair, callsign Sunshine, and I'm a retired Navy F-18 pilot. I graduated from the Naval Academy with a bachelor's in aerospace engineering, flew S-3 Vikings for several years, then I picked up a master's in astronautical engineering and transitioned to the F-18. I flew the Legacy Hornet and Super Hornet in the skies over Iraq and Afghanistan. Then I became an aerospace engineering instructor at the Naval Academy. In my final Navy chapter, I was an experimental test pilot. I've had a chance to fire weapons both in anger, i.e. combat, as well as out of curiosity in test. I have rendezvoused with and flown alongside both ship-launched and submarine-launched missiles, followed weapons dropped off of aircraft, and flew some weapon profiles to just before impact with captive weapons on my wing. In this series, we're going to explore the different phases of the U.S. Navy's test and evaluation as was applied to both the Super Hornet and some air-launched weapons. My guests will include the chief test pilot of the Super Hornet program, an operational test pilot whose career was a lot like Maverick's, going from F-14s and Top Gun to F-18s in test. One of the best test wizzos in my book anyway, with whom I flew some weapon evaluation flights. A current coworker who had the distinct pleasure of participating in both air-to-air and air-to-surface weapon testing when she was in uniform. And if all of that excites you, we'll wrap up the series by talking with one of my Naval Academy roommates who joined the Marine Corps and went on to become the commanding officer of the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. He's got some good insight into becoming a test pilot. So settle in and get comfy, because we're about to go down some pretty deep technical rabbit holes and pop up for air to hopefully provide a balance of education and entertainment in the Test Pilot series.
This is authentic.
Welcome back to another episode in the Test Pilot series. Today, we're going to focus on the developmental test of the U.S. Navy's F-18 Super Hornet. So, a personal favorite is I got to fly a lot, and who better to have as a guest than the chief test pilot of the entire U.S. Navy developmental test program, retired Navy Captain Rob Knockers Niewarner. So I met Rob when I was teaching at the Naval Academy, and he was basically the senior guy in the aero department there, as you could imagine. And when it comes to intellect, this guy just kind of blows it right off the top of the charts. He got his BS in physics from the Naval Academy in 1981, and he went on to get his master's in electrical engineering at Johns Hopkins, followed by his PhD in aeronautical engineering. And finally, he attended the U.S. Navy Test Pilot School. So look at the big brain on Knockers. Anyway, without further ado, let's bring in Knockers.
Hey, good morning and welcome back. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the developmental test of the Super Hornet, appropriately named the Rhino. And we brought with us today our in-studio guest, Dr. Rob Niewarner, retired captain in the United States Navy, who has a PhD. He was the Super Hornet's chief test pilot for the integrated test team. So good morning, Rob. How are you?
Good morning, Sunshine. It's a real privilege to be with you.
It is, yeah. So Knockers, callsign Knockers, and I, first time I met him was actually, I came back to teach at the Naval Academy in the Air Department, and you had been there for a while, correct?
Yeah, I joined the Naval Academy faculty right on the heels of the Super Hornet program in 1998.
Nice. Okay, so let's start off with the call sign. So your call sign is Knockers. Is there? I'm assuming there's a good story there.
Yeah, no, sorry, no salacious story. One of my lieutenant commanders, department heads in VF-84 couldn't pronounce my last name. And so it started off, Dave Ripple was his name, and it started off as Knee Knockers, which just was way too long a call sign. So it just got truncated to Knockers over time. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so no
sorry to
crazy
let you down.
Story.
No great stories.
So, hey, Knockers, before we get into the developmental test of the Super Hornet, I'd love to hear your background and why did you get into this line of work? What were your interests, your upbringing, your background, if you will, and then we'll obviously talk about the Super Hornet, and then we'll finish up with where you currently are.
Yeah, so I grew up in St. Louis, which will actually play into this story later on with Super Hornet, and but knew from the time I was a little boy I wanted to be a naval officer. Loved the literature of the sea, and so came to the Naval Academy with a class of 1981. Actually thought I wanted to be a submariner at that point. So, had this dreams of command at sea, and figured out as a midshipman that's not what I wanted to do. And so by the end of my time as a midshipman and graduating in 81, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. So flew Tomcats through the 1980s. I was a physics major and had a master's in electrical engineering prior to commissioning. And so I knew the technical piece sort of interested me. Went through test pilot school in 1989 and then moved into the Tomcat flight test. So I did a lot of F-14A work, a lot of F-14B engine work. The B had been in the fleet for about a year. And then I did initial sea trials on F-14D. Simultaneously, I was a Navy pilot assigned to YF-22, YF-23. And at the conclusion of that lieutenant test tour, I decided I really wanted to stay in flight tests. So that's when the Navy sent me for a PhD. And then I came back to Pax River in the mid-90s, about a year before the Super Hornet program stood up.
So you're definitely a math and science kind of guy. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'm kind of the fighter geek. So, midshipmen, my students today think it's hilarious that, I came here wanting to be a submariner. And, now I think I'm the oldest active pilot in the Department of the Navy.
Nice, active. So what do you currently fly before we get into the Super?
Yeah, so, I'm an old man, so little light airplanes is all I'm trusted in. And we teach a flight test engineering course, and we've got a Baron that we lease from a local FBO that we use for 1967s, which is a quirky airplane pre-Part 23, which is nice for what we use it for, which is an engineering test bed. Because the mids find some of those quirks over the course of our time in flying. And that's a privilege to still be involved in. Oh, I had a couple of great stories from the fall. One of them was first flight with a midshipman where he'd never been on a light airplane before. And 10 minutes into the flight, he told me, I don't know whether I'm terrified or exhilarated right now. He goes, maybe a little of both. And those kind of moments are just really priceless for me. So introducing young aspiring naval aviators to flying.
Very nice. Okay, cool. So obviously, thanks for the background and all the accolades. I mean, and later we'll talk about your basically all the professional organizations that you're part of. But if you don't mind, we'll dive into the subject at hand.
Okay.
So thinking about, we're back in the 90s, right? So can you set the stage, big picture with the Navy? What kind of programs were currently going on? What was being canceled? What were the tensions at the time?
So, in 1990, what naval aviation had on its horizon was A-12 was a developmental program, kind of flying Dorito. Think of B-2 shrunk down to the size of a flight deck. It was in process, and I was read into that program. And then also the Navy was a part of the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, which was essentially the Navy was going to buy a variant of the F-22 or F-23, depending on who was involved or who won. I was the Navy pilot assigned to that program. And it was a couple of weeks away from flying the YF-23 when the Navy pulled out. But really in the spring of 91, Secretary Cheney canceled A-12 fairly abruptly, triggering off a almost decade-long, multi-billion-dollar lawsuit between McDonnell Douglas and the government. That'll show up later in the story, too. Canceled Navy's involvement in YF-22, YF-23. And Tomcat 21 was scrapped. Matter of fact, not only was it scrapped, but Congress directed that Grumman destroy the tooling for after the last F-14D was built so that Tomcats couldn't rise again. So I can remember a bike ride with Dave Dunaway, who later retired as a 3-star. We were both lieutenant commanders in Monterey in the mid-90s, and Decoy and I having this conversation over, what's our leadership thinking? Where are the airplanes going to come from to fill the flight decks? And, we thought that they had sold us down the river. What we didn't know was Super Hornet was being born, and that they were actually, and these are guys like John Lockard, Brent Bennett, Bill Bowes, all retired 3-stars now. And they set naval aviation on a course of financial soundness that, essentially has allowed the Navy to recapitalize naval aviation. I now look back and go, wow, those guys were just so wise. But the press was, this is so 1993 in August. The people in Revolve still call it the 10 days of August because they were locked down in St. Louis for 10 days to come up with a program to save naval aviation. that was going to be Super Hornet, because otherwise all we had was all these old airplanes on the flight deck. And they came out with a program that was going to have first flight in 95, delivered to the fleet in 99, $4.88 billion. And the pressure was on from everyone inside the Pentagon and inside Congress that not a dollar late, or not a dollar more, and not a day late. And that'll frame some of the decisions that and the questions that we're going to talk about here later. So that was the context. And when I came onto the program in early '95, we understood that the mission was to save naval aviation.
And so, okay, thanks, Knockers, for that kind of setting the stage, if you will. So thinking of as we call it, really the legacy Hornet, right? That was a derivative of the YF-17, the Cobra, which was kind of the loser to the F-16 in the lightweight fighter program, right? So can we say that the legacy Hornet is the basis for the Super Hornet?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And because of the need to, both cost constraints to make sure that this was an affordable program, there's a lot that was done that was essentially invest the money to get increased capability. And we had this mantra within Super Hornet: range, payload, growth, bring back survivability. Those were the 5 Ys to Super Hornet: range, payload, growth, bring back survivability, all targeted to address problems with the legacy. But at the same time, there was a real consciousness and the other thing is we were handing the program over to engineers at McDonnell Douglas who had been thinking about how to improve Hornet for years. And so they did. All the things they wanted to fix, they were given the chance to do that. So the architectures, the engines, the 414 is a bigger version of the 404. That'll come up later too. The architectures, the software, everything that could be copy pasted into Rhinos was copy pasted because it was the low risk path. The only new software that we flew in the early Rhinos was for the new displays, upfront control display, for example. But otherwise, the software was all the same. Flight control architecture was all the same. Now, some manufacturing technologies mean that the dry airplane weight grew by 33%, but the parts count is actually 40% lower in a Rhino than a legacy. And so all that touch labor essentially was eliminated. And that's why, in 95, when Rhinos were coming off the assembly line, they were actually the same cost as a legacy. And it was because so much money was saved in manufacturing compared to a legacy. Okay,
so Knockers, thank you for that. So bigger but fewer pieces, we'll call it. Can you give us one example as a speed brake? Is that a good example how it became a speed brake function instead of an additional control surface?
Yeah, actually, so speed brake would be, we got rid of that flat panel speed brake that was on a legacy, and this was the idea of an engineer at McDonnell Douglas, which is bought by Boeing in the middle of the program. John Hagen, it was his idea, get rid of the speed brake, and so just turn all the flight controls all akimbo. Yeah, there's some interesting things there too that, the first time we deployed the speed brake in formation, the 2 airplanes just couldn't stay together. What we realized was it wasn't the Rhino that moved, it was the C. That the C went through this big pitch transient with the deployment of the speed brake, and the Rhino was just rock solid, just didn't budge.
Okay,
but
so
it took us a little while to figure out that actually the problem was the legacy, not the Rhino.
Yeah, and in this configuration, the section out there, it's a Charlie F-18C leading around an F-18E for this?
Yeah, it was one of my chase planes. So, it was probably a B model airplane that was my chase. And so, but I was doing some formation flying qualities assessments. And one of those things was to assess the flying qualities of the speed brake deployment. And we realized that it was the Charlie that went through this huge pitch transient. And whereas the Echo, again, ailerons go one way, rudders go one other way, stabilators go another way. It's all kind of everything akimbo. That is actually, it's more effective. You slow faster than you do with a C, but it's also a more rock solid platform. And that really is all attributable to John Hagen's work in St. Louis.
Gotcha. And then, so with this speed brake functionality, we'll call it, and less parts, but more logic, we'll call it that. Would you also say that's the beginning of what we now have and what the current pilots enjoy of precision landing mode, or PLM?
So let's talk about the flight controls a little bit, because that's a big change too. The Hornets, the legacy Hornets A through D, came together at a point where the Navy and its conservatism was really skeptical of fly-by-wire. And so there was a mechanical system that was built in. Every, C, D, or A, B, C, D out there flying is still dragging around about 350 pounds of mechanical flight controls that's there in the event that the fly-by-wire system were to fail. And, Mech actually, I don't know that it ever saved an airplane. It probably cost us some airplanes. It certainly had a maintenance tail associated with, or still does. Any Charlies and Deltas still flying still have a maintenance tail associated with that Mech. And then the other thing about mechanical flight controls is they take up these really long volumes in the airplane where you need these straight lines that go the length of the airplane. So getting rid of Mech bought us weight, bought us volume, reduced the maintenance man hours required. So that's an example. And then, the fly-by-wire architecture on the Rhino then does set up the ability to do what we've seen with PLM in the precision landing modes or magic carpet in Rhinos and Growlers.
Gotcha. And when you talk about Mech, so did you ever fly Mech in the Charlie or the Legacy?
Well, yeah, I've got maybe 150 hours of legacy time, largely chasing my teammates during Super Hornet. I didn't do any of the Mech testing, so I've never flown the airplane. I don't think I've ever flown the airplane with in Mech, the legacy airplane in Mech.
Okay, yeah. Just because of the all I ever did was some simulator flying, if you will, of Mech, and obviously not the real deal, but just the lack of feedback, right? A lot of opportunity to go into PIO, if I remember correctly, the pilot-induced oscillation.
Yeah, but I mean, more crucially, from the standpoint of so when we talk about Super Hornet and getting rid of Mech, this is actually, and we're getting kind of geeky technically here now, but that's okay.
That's okay.
When you get rid of Mech, it allows you now. So a Mech airplane had to be a stable airplane, and so a Legacy is still a stable airplane, which means on approach, you've got a download on the horizontal tail, which creates landing speed, goes up.
Okay.
The shocker in a Super Hornet, and this goes into the, again, range, payload, growth, bring back, survivability, is a Super Hornet, though its wing got bigger, its carrier landing design gross weight went up, and you can land with, 11, 12,000 pounds of stuff, fuel and stores in a Rhino. The Rhino's unstable. And that instability, because you don't have Mech, when you get rid of Mech, you can now have an unstable airplane. Unstable airplane means the tails are uploaded on approach because the center of gravity is so much farther aft. And the result is, though the wing loading of a Super Hornet is 15% higher than a Legacy, the approach speed's actually 10 knots slower.
Which is fantastic. And I noticed it at the boat, just the approach speeds and the way that the burble affects us, right? How much time we spend in the burble.
But I mean, the key thing is that 10 knot drop in approach speed, that's what gets you all that bring back. That a Legacy can come aboard with 4,500, maybe 5,000 pounds of fuel and stores. A Rhino can come aboard with 11,000 pounds of fuel and stores. That's a huge operational flexibility. And did you fly Legacies at all in the fleet?
I did both, yes.
Yeah. And so you the goofy bubble and carrying around all these drop tanks, and you can only take off with so many stores, because if you carry too much stuff off the front end, then it means you have to throw it in the water before you come aboard the back end. Rhino, and so that's this issue of carrier suitability or the bring back, increasing the amount of weight that you could land with at the ship, which dramatically reduced your anxiety at the boat because you could land with so much more fuel. That traces back through to the elimination of Mech from the flight controls.
I am so with you. So with bring back, you eloquently explained it, but just to double check here for the folks at home, we're talking about the capability to come back. If you're going to take off with a bunch of bombs, you go into country, and I had many opportunities where I would provide close air support, and not all my bombs were used. So basically now you got to come back with a finite a weight, if you will, to the boat, and it's going to be a blend of ordnance and fuel. Fuel is obviously options, but if I come back with more ordnance because I didn't deploy it in country, then I bring back less fuel, which provides me with fewer options of going around, bolters or whatnot, and more stress. So I totally noticed the difference between combat ops in the Chuck or the Charlie, right, and coming back with a, max trap could have been a 4.0, so that'd be 4,000 pounds of gas versus I remember routinely coming back and the Rhinos checking in, and then with me as a Rhino also, having 9.0 or something like that for a max trap. So it was awesome.
Yeah, which is a world of difference to the anxiety level for particularly a nugget trying to get back aboard the ship at night.
Amen.
And that anxiety that you experience as a JO behind the ship, that is actually traced all the way back through, moving getting this approach speed down, which is done by moving the center of gravity aft, which is done by getting rid of Mach. And we also reduce the weight of the airplane by 350 pounds.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, I mean, but that's one of scores of things across the airplane where, these real sharp folks at St. Louis, men and women there, who'd been thinking about how do we improve on the Charlie? We gave them the chance in the 90s to, make it better. And they did, and spent the money wisely where they could get an increase of capability and yet still very mindful of these very hard cost caps and schedule caps to get us capability. I once asked Joe Dyer, my program manager, and he'll figure later in the conversation about, why not thrust vectoring? But in the 1990s, 4 programs had demonstrated for thrust vectoring. He goes, we're looking at campaign models. He goes, it just didn't buy itself onto the airplane. Too high risk, didn't create in a campaign model. When we look at campaign models of, aircraft carriers against, some imagined threat, he said, that capability, while pretty cool for the fighter pilot, he goes, it doesn't actually change the campaign outcomes. He goes, there's other technologies, however, that have much bigger impact. And so that's where we're putting the money. And so, aye, skipper.
Yeah. Still at the end of the day, aye, sir. Hey, so when you say campaign models, so could we the civilians equate that to trade space?
The campaign model is going to be essentially simulation war games where they're looking at, a carrier battle groups in some threat environment and, essentially playing the games out in simulation. Could be manned, could be unmanned. It's going to be some sort of computer-based games. But essentially, injecting different technologies and then evaluating, what makes a difference? What is it that's just really cool, that's new, shiny toy? Or what is it that actually makes a difference in terms of how many targets we strike in a day off a carrier battle group and how many airplanes come home? And so these are decisions were being made based upon, if we have this amount of money to spend, what's going to buy us the biggest capability, both in terms of the lethality of the carrier battle group and then as well getting airplanes home at the end of the day.
Which getting airplanes home at the end of the day then would be also safety, right? So it's not only operational capability, but also safety factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, an interesting little tangent, but, the 2 most important technologies of the 90s that dramatically changed the lethality and safety of the carrier battle group. One is precision guided munitions. That one's pretty obvious from Desert Storm. The second one is actually reliability and maintainability. The improvements there dramatically changed the number of sorties we can generate in a daily basis from a carrier. And so, that figured prominently into the Rhino as well. And also why, for example, we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of why Tomcat had to go away. I'm going to disagree there with Ward Carroll strongly, but it's the R&M. You got to be able to generate sorties, and you get to generate sorties by having really, really reliable airplanes.
Gotcha. And would you say that the F-14 and then the legacy F-18, were they also very reliable aircraft?
No.
That might have been a leading question.
Yeah. So, I came into Rhinos with I guess 1,800 hours of Tomcat time. And the shocker for me in the Rhino was, every time you got in a Tomcat, it took about a half an hour to 40 minutes to coax it out of the line. To get everything woken up and online, and you're doing the circuit. The circuit breaker scene in Maverick, Top Gun Maverick, absolutely accurate. That's so accurate. And you're cycling all these kinds of circuit breakers to coax all the systems back online. And then once you take off, you inventory what's working, because it was never the case that everything always worked. It's just so you inventory what's working, what's not. My first missile shoot as a junior officer, I had no HUD. And I walked to the airplane with a grease pencil to mark the armament data line on the HUD with a grease pencil.
So, then, and if you do
that was an up jet for a Missile X. The fact that I had no HUD.
And then how did you know how to calibrate your grease, your booger mark on the windscreen or the HUD? How did you do that?
It's just, that's it. It was just a booger mark. Yeah.
It's a TLAR that looks about right. Yeah.
Yeah. So and we were running around 90 maintenance man hours per flight hour in the in the mid 90s on the Tomcat, and the Rhino was a full order of magnitude smaller. You're down below 10.
Nice. So looking at 9, something like that. Fantastic.
Yeah. Down from 90, over 90.
Nice. Hey, so earlier you rocket rippled off 5 metrics that started with range. And could you just deliberately talk to each of those, and specifically, did the Rhino, and it doesn't have to be a long one, but was it so for range, was it overall a thumbs up, kind of a Caesar in the middle thumb, if you will, or was it a down where there were some stronger metrics than others?
So the issue right from the very start, when A model Hornets entered the fleet, and I was there for that, one of my classmates, Tom Gurney, was the first Hornet baby. And Gerns will be my deputy then on Super Hornet. He was the first guy who went straight from winging to the Tomcat rag. So this is 1983. And, right from the very start, we knew that, we had to change flight ops. We went from 1+45 cycles to, essentially an hour and a half long cycle on the flight decks because of, going from A7s, which was a long-legged airplane, to Legacy Hornets, which were very clearly a short-legged airplane.
And what do you mean by a cycle?
So, at sea in a ship, typically, in the mid 80s with intruders, Tomcats, A7s in the air wing, there would be a launch every 45 minutes. And then after you launched event 2, you would recover event 1. So, your nominal flight length in the 80s was a 2.0, where you were because we were launching on 145 intervals, you recovered after the prior, or you recovered after the next event launched. And so, there was a lot of struggle incorporating legacies in the late 80s because of, they couldn't handle a 1+45 cycle, 1 hour, 45 minute cycle. And so, do we go to things like flex deck? And I think ultimately settled on a 1+30 cycle, which is really hard on the sailors on the flight deck to turn airplanes around with that much shorter a turnaround time. But, legacies were more reliable than some of the airplanes they were replacing. Not as reliable as Rhinos, but we made it work. But the Legacy had just some glaring problems. So range was among the first. So in the Rhino, you go from 10.8 in a Charlie, 10,800 pounds in a Charlie to 14,400 pounds in a E model. Legacies always flew off the ship with 2 drop tanks, 2,000-pound drop tanks. Legacies are flying with 1 3,700-pound single center line. So the drag actually comes down. You're using the fuel more efficiently, and you're carrying way more fuel. Whereas a single center line Legacy had 12.2. A Rhino with a single center line is up at 17.7. Do I have the numbers right? It's been a while.
Yes, that sure sounds right. Yeah.
I haven't flown it for 20 years, but yeah, some of these numbers are really.
You still got it.
Yeah. So range was the first thing. Payload's the next one. That going from 4 wing weapon stations on a Legacy, 2 of which are always filled by fuel tanks, because the Legacies frequently flew triple bubble, 3 fuel tanks. So essentially, you had 1 weapon station on each wing available on a Legacy. Where. When with a Rhino, you go with a single center line, you actually go with 3 available wing stations on each wingtip, from 2 available stations to 2 available stations across the airplane to 6 available wing stations.
That's a game changer.
Yeah. So range, payload, bring back. That's the hardest one to describe, just as you'd mentioned. Oh, growth. Growth was, we were capped out in the sea. There was no more room for advanced technologies. All the growth space in the airplane was used up. And to get new technologies into the airplane, we needed more growth room. And when we finished the development program in '99, I think there was about 4, maybe 6 cubic foot of empty space in the airplane. And in '99, we didn't know what was going to go in there. Essentially we're creating space. And that growth is not just volume, but electrical capacity and cooling capacity, which tend to be the constraints. We had to make room, create an airplane where we could, and there's technologies, because I'm not in the program and been out of the program for a long time and am not cleared on what's now in the airplane. There's things that you saw flying Rhinos at sea that were technologies that didn't even exist when we developed the airplane. But essentially what we were creating was the space in order to put that stuff in.
So a great case in point of that, if you don't mind. So talking about electrical loads, so that's, current basically driving all the computers, if you will, the cooling and the actual real estate itself. So I think of the dynamic targeting processor, the DTP, right, where we can have all these high resolution images on board. So back when you flew the Rhino, they had space for it, but they didn't have it. Correct? Is that a
yeah? But we knew that stuff was coming. Actually, we didn't know exactly what was coming, but we knew that things were going to develop. I mean, now 20 years removed from flying Rhinos, we knew stuff was coming and would come, that we would need cooling capacity, volume, and electrical power. And so Rhino, so when we talk about range payload growth, this is that growth, is creating the space for that to include the phased array radar that you flew with. And then survivability. The last is, anytime you're going to hang fuel and weapons out on the wings, it's not going to be a low observable airplane.
When it comes to radar, right? You're saying,
right? Radar, it's not going to be low observable. All that trash is going to be radar reflective. But the thing is, there were a lot of things we could do in order to significantly reduce, and so it's not a digital, is it low observable or not? But if you reduce the radar cross section, you're still reducing the threat envelopes. And so there are a lot of technologies in the airplane that reduce. Some are obvious from the outside. You just look at a picture and plan form, and you see the edge alignment on a Rhino that the Legacy doesn't have. There's a couple other features that, if you're looking at it from on the flight line in an air show, you'll see some features that are related to reducing the radar cross section, improving the survivability. And then there were some other technologies that the Rhino got that Legacy didn't have. And in order to improve the survivability, it's not an LO airplane, and that's because of hanging stuff outside. Mm-hmm. An F-35C is not an LO airplane when you hang trash on the wings, or weapons and fuel. But still, we were able to significantly reduce the vulnerability of the airplane with some smart, again, going back to Joe Dyer's comment, with some smart applications of the technology in ways that financially made sense at the time. We wanted the most survivability per dollar. The program was very conscious of that.
Okay, so for all those 5 metrics, we'll say you wanted obviously the biggest bang for the buck, but it is a series of compromises.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, that's well said. Joe Dyer was specifically looking for maximizing essentially fleet value for the dollars he was given. And the dollars were a hard cap, 4.88 and not $1 more.
Yeah. So, okay, you know what? Maybe we should pay a little tribute to the folks, right? So the integrated test team. So who were they? Kind of what was their significance of the test team? And was this a relatively new or novel approach the Navy took?
Yeah, so prior to Super Hornet, the way in which developmental flight test was done was pretty much the contractor was on contract to develop the airplane and would have these requirement test points that they had to check off. And then the Navy would intermittently get a glimpse of the airplane, that maybe 2 weeks a year in order to fly some number of test points. And there was government test points and there were contractor test points. And there were government contractor pilots and there was the government pilots. And this created huge inefficiencies, both from a financial perspective, but also in a time perspective, using the assets wisely, the airframes wisely. And so some of the Air Force had dabbled with these integrated test teams, though I don't think quite to the extent that we did. And so the integrated test team, which went into Hazelrig Hangar, named after one of my former CTPs who lost his life in summer of 90, Axel Hazelrig. In Hazelrig, what we brought together was 400 people total, 300 of them representing McDonnell Douglas, GE, and Northrop, and then 100 of them government, Navy. The ready room was to be 5 Navy pilots, 5 company pilots. So, yeah, I was the Navy chief test pilot, but my partner was Fred Madwald, who's the company's chief test pilot. And we'll talk more about Fred. So this mixed ready room, and the goal was there are no Navy flights. There are no company flights. We're working from one test program. If it's your turn to fly, it's your turn to fly. And so the only truly company flights were the very first flight on all 7 airplanes Fred flew.
And sorry, why, like an acceptance flight kind of thing? Or?
Well, it was essentially the first flight off the factory line in St. Louis. Fred flew those flights.
Gotcha.
On all 7. Part of it is he just wanted to say that he'd flown all 7 first flights. Now, the way it worked out, so the team was on the company side, Fred Madmold, who's McDonnell Douglas. And Fred, when I was, 6-8 years earlier, I'd done a lot of flying with Fred where I was his safety pilot when he was doing flutter flight test and legacies. And I was in a Tomcat as his safety pilot. Then, so Fred Madwald was the lead. Northrop's lone pilot on the team was Jim Sandberg. Sandy at that point, Naval Academy 69, was among the most experienced test pilots in the country. He had B-2 flight test. He had F-20 flight test. I'd met Sandy in ground school for the YF-23. So he'd been one of the lead pilots on F-23 and then a bunch of black stuff. And Sandy was just really a fount of knowledge. And I still consider Sandy among my mentors. Dave Desmond was going to do all the loads testing. So Dave's the only one who really had his own airplane. And then Jeff Crutchfield was to be one of our systems guys. Jeff lost his life before the program, or while the program was getting in a air show practice. That really hurt. Everybody loved Jeff. I had known him at church when I was a JO and was looking forward to get him to know him better because he just had this reputation as an awesome dad, and I wanted to learn from him. But we lost Jeff before he moved over to the program. Phil Perozzi, and then essentially the contractor Fred wound up hiring Ricardo Traven as the last of his ready room, or last of his part of the ready room. And we actually had this all shared office. And Ricardo had worked for me when he was a Canadian Forces pilot. And Ricardo later proves to be the hero in solving wing drop. So every Rhino pilot out there can attribute the fact that we fixed wing drop to Ricardo Traven, he's currently Boeing's chief test pilot for 787 down in Charleston. A little bit of how I got the job. We were flying to St. Louis, and my boss was in the back seat, and this was part of the buildup for first flight. And he said, "Knockers, do you know how you got this job?" And I said, "Well, I presumed my advanced development work and my PhD gave me some credibility." And he goes, "Nah." He goes, "Fred and I have a shared history. Both he and Fred were pretty big, larger than life figures." He goes, "We have a history." He goes, "I needed somebody with a reputation for calm to be the buffer between me and Fred." And my reply was, "Well, why didn't you just give me the black and white jersey?" Because there were a lot of days where it was pretty much me and I've got some funny stories between, solving issues between Fred and Bert. Then Tom Gurney, a classmate of mine from the Naval Academy and Test Pilot School, was my deputy. He was the high-time Hornet pilot in the Navy at the time, and he was going to be my carrier suit lead. Gurns is still among my best friends. Let's see, who else? Frank Morley, who's currently a 3-star in the Pentagon, was one of my JOs. Funny story with Frank and his first flight at the ship, which we might come back to. Then Tom Hull was a weapons guy. Later on, Matt Teisler was on our team. Sting Wallace, who's now with Boeing, was on the team, and Ken Ham, whom you know. Hawk was some of the JOs that cycled through my ready room on a regular basis. And I'd get those JOs for 2 years at a time during the development. But the idea was we were going to share the flights, and there were no company flights and government flights. And it really was very cool because every one of those organizations brought their first team, and they were just, everyone else on the base was on a compressed work schedule. They worked 9 days every 2 weeks, and we were on CWS as well. It was come to work on Saturday because we were years without the Saturday off, or largely we flew every Saturday. And it really got to a place where, it just really didn't matter whose watermark was on your paycheck. Because the team was truly integrated and we were all working towards one end. And my test conductor on any given day might be a government guy or might be a company guy. And it just didn't matter. It was all this group of people who were just really focused on one thing, and that was the quality of what we delivered to the fleet, whether they were government or whether they were Navy or GE or Northrop or McDonnell Douglas Boeing. So that was pretty cool, just working with this great group of people.
Okay, so novel approach in that they removed the fence, we'll call it, between private sector or corporate, I guess, and then the government. And then you guys, sounds like a great cast. if you will, and you spent a lot of hours together, long days, long hours together, 6 days a week, as you mentioned, and all that. So would you say the chemistry ignited right away? Was it, or is it kind of a build-up approach?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked this question because, it gives me the chance to talk about one of my greatest professional failures. So Fred's, and it'll tie a couple things together here too,
okay, sure.
Shine. So, it was announced, and the company was really resisting this integrated testing. Really resisting. Remember, at this point, they're involved in this multi-billion-dollar lawsuit with the Navy over the cancellation of A-12.
Okay.
Fred and I go to lunch at a Chevy's in St. Louis, and we'd flown together years before, but he didn't really know me, and I didn't really know him. And so Fred and I sit down, and he goes, Knockers, he goes, I really want this to work. He goes, but everyone in the company believes that the Navy is out to screw us. He goes, the Navy screwed us with A-12. He goes, that's the prevalent attitude here in St. Louis. And he goes, my own boss believes we shouldn't let the Navy inside the fence for the development of Rhino. All right, so we're starting from a position of tremendous skepticism within the company about how the Navy would treat them, because they felt just really screwed on A-12, which was, at this point, 4 years ago. 4 years, 91 to 95. So first flight, the program's on, conceived in August of 92. We've got airplanes on the ramp turning in November of 95. So brand new design, 3.5 years, 3 years and a couple months from conception, contract signed to an airplane turning on the ramp. So I get out to St. Louis in November, and I'm pretty much spending Monday to Friday at St. Louis. And I show up one night and to participate in the ground turns before first flight. And Fred picks me up at the airport. We go over to the hangar, and he goes, "Hey, okay, Knockers, I'm going to take this third shift, and then you just you go get some sleep." And I go, "Fred, you're at home. I'm on the road." He said, "I slept on the airplane flying into St. Louis. You go home to your wife and kids, and I'll stay and I'll work third shift because we're a team, right?" And Fred looks at me and goes, "You mean the government really is here to help?" And so this was sort of the building. I didn't realize that was a building of the trust between Fred and I. One of the other things that was important, this goes back to our leadership, and this is Joe Dyer. Joe sat Fred and I down at the beginning, about the same time frame before first flight. He goes, I want the two of you to argue in your ready room and have fierce debates in your ready room about what's good for the program. He goes, but it is really, really important when you walk out of your ready room, there is one pilot opinion. Because the suits will try to drive a stake or drive a wedge between you. He goes, there must be one pilot opinion. And Fred and I, that was pretty important to us. So ground turns, November of 95 in St. Louis. It's sleeting and snowing and just, and I grew up in St. Louis, but this is cool for me because I'm actually back home. Unfortunately, my dad had died the previous year and my mom left St. Louis, so I'm staying in a hotel. But, when I left for the Naval Academy in 77, I never imagined I would be flying fighters out of Lambert Field. And, my dad would take me up and we'd watch Phantoms come off it's 72 Phantoms a month were made in St. Louis when I was growing up. Now we buy at most 48 Rhinos a year. But so this was cool for me to be back in my hometown, inside of the Arch, which my dad was part of building. And, so that it's just cool. Lambert Field, my boyhood home.
Nice.
Yeah, it was really awesome. So first flight is 29 November of 95. So the contract said fly ship 1 and 2, E1 and E2 by the end of the year. And so the first flight was about 35 days early. And then kind of a benchmark of the Hornet program. Every Hornet delivered has been on time and under budget. Since then, every single Rhino has been on time and under budget. So, of which the company should justifiably be proud. That's pretty unusual in DoD. But first flight. So Fred's flying first flight, but another one that I'd really like your audience to understand is anyone who's ever flown a Rhino, they owe so much to Fred Madmold. Fred passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. And I understand from others that, V-22 pilots likewise owe a debt to Fred Madenwall that he put that program back on the rails after it was, really in trouble. But, there's so much in the Hornet that, again, Joe Dyer told Fred and I, he goes, this has got to be a great pilot airplane. And it's your responsibility, you too, that this is a great pilot airplane. And Fred really, really cared passionately about the JO that would fly this airplane. Really cared about that.
So the focused use case was the brand new guy, if you will.
Oh yeah, and Fred was unafraid of fighting with the company, with his own company, when the welfare of the JO flying the airplane was at stake.
Good.
Fred could be a bull in a china shop kind of personality, but man, that was the thing that drove him, was the quality of what the fleet operator got. And it didn't matter. Okay, so I got to tell a story. So one day, I've griped something on the airplane. This is probably 97 or so. We're talking about team chemistry. So this is not too far off. I had an issue that I felt really needed to be fixed. I don't even remember what it was, but I'm having this kind of fight with my boss, and my boss is going, "No, that's not that big a deal. It's just not that big a deal." And Fred jumps in and is like, "No, Bert, this is a problem. Knockers is right, and this needs fixed." And so at this point in time, I kind of back away a little bit, because now it's a fight between Fred and my boss, and I'm kind of watching the two of them go at it about the severity of this particular issue. And then Fred finally goes, "Bert, the company screwed this up. The company needs to pay to fix it." And this kind of goes on for another couple cycles with Bert just getting, and he will tell you he can be volatile. His call sign was once Fuse, as in short. And he's getting wound up with Fred. And I finally had to jump in, put my jersey on and jump in between the two of them. And it's like, "Boss, the company just said the company screwed this up and the company needs to pay to fix it." "Well, then what are we arguing about?" It's like, precisely. Let them fix it, because this needs fixed. So, that's the kind of chemistry that built. So back to where I really screwed this up. So first flight, end of November 95, out of St. Louis. Fred's got first flight in E1, the first E model. And Sandy is the safety chase, and I'm the photo chase. So we've got two legacies that and I've got a B model with a photographer in the back. And 5 minutes into the flight, Fred has a bleed air caution light. Now, in the Tomcat, a bleed air caution light is the same thing as a fire light.
Because what is the bleed air? What's the source?
Bleed air means thanks for good question. Thanks. Bleed air means that the hot air coming off the compressor, which we use for air conditioning and literally for cooling and all sorts of compressed air activities around the airplane. But it's 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit when it comes off the compressor. And then we use it for a whole bunch of ancillary aux functions around the airplane. But it's 1,200 degrees. And so if you have a leak in it, it can burn things around it. And so it's the same as a firelight. So rather than talk to the data station, Fred spins the knob on the bleed air and just cycles the switch to get the light go out.
And what is spinning the knob?
The knob. You've flown this more recently. I think there's an off, left, right, both, which essentially is what it's a little rotary knob, and we typically would fly with it in both, and Fred just essentially spun the thing around the dial from both to off, and then back to both, and the light went out, and so pressed on. But the thing is, there was no conversation. No conversation with the data team, because there's 30 people watching strip charts. What did they see? There's no conversation with the safety chase or with me. There's no conversation. Fred comes back from first flight. Oh, and then it comes back about 15 minutes later. So we abort first flight 20 minutes into the flight. And a first flight for a company is a really big deal. So there's thousands of people around the field watching the first flight of Super Hornet. It takes off and we chase it. And then, of course, it comes back and lands in about 20 minutes because of this bleed air caution light. Again, which in my world that's a fire light. You don't just secure a fire light and then continue to fly. So Fred lands, and then his public pronouncement is, "This airplane's ready to go to sea." And and we got back in the ready room like, "Fred, I can't believe you said that. We land with an emergency. We have a whopping 20 minutes and you're ready to say this airplane is ready to go to sea? You got to be kidding me. Now, the other thing is I was upset with him over the fact that there was no consultation with the data team and with the chase about what he was doing. He just did it on his own. Here's my blunder. I saw my boss and I said, we need to have a government-only meeting. And so we caucused in a conference room. There was about a dozen of us who were, Navy, either, the two of us active duty and then the rest Navy engineers. And we had a government-only meeting, which was a legacy process. We used to do that all the time, is have these government-only meetings. And we had a government-only meeting to talk about Fred's mistake. And we came out of that, after, 45 minutes or something like that. And Fred's sitting in the couch and, so it's Bert and I, my boss, and I go up to Fred, and Fred goes, I understand that I screwed up, but are we an integrated test team or not? It doesn't seem to me that a Navy-only meeting fits the construct of an integrated test team.
And your response was?
Oh, I was just crushed. I had stripped Fred of what should be one of the most momentous days in his life, the first flight of a brand new airplane, and I'd crushed him. And boy, that's that calling an all government meeting is ranks among my premier professional blunders of my life. Because I stripped him of that and, in fact, had undermined the very thing we were trying to do, and that was have this integrated voice. Now, Fred forgave me, for which I'm forever grateful. And then we built up this rapport with one another. That other story I told about, is illustrative of well, I'll tell one more story with, it's actually about 6 months later. And it has to do with the upfront control display, which was just this horrendous piece of kit the first handful of months. We had a meeting with government suits, the contractor suits and the program leadership, just talk about where the airplane was and what was going on. And I stood up and I was talking about how bad the upfront control display was. At one point in time, I was coming into the break at 350 knots and I can't get on the tower frequency. I can't get the tower. And I'm coming into the break and, I kind of need to be on the tower frequency. And so I'm getting so frustrated with it that, you tap it, it didn't work, tap it. And well, tap it harder. It's like, so I actually bruised the display because I hit it so hard. And then as soon as I did, I was like, what a knucklehead.
Okay, so if you don't mind, Knocker, sorry. So the
I know. I just
display is going to be a keypad, right? The predominant interaction is with the keypad. Right.
Yeah, so a Legacy had a mechanical keypad for putting in things like radio frequencies, like tower frequency. One of the real upgrades to the Hornet cockpit or the Rhino cockpit was there was now a control display rather than upfront control. It was now an upfront control display where it could be a display. So it was a keypad, touchpad, like we're now familiar with on our phones and our iPads. But in 1995, that was really novel. And they were still trying to figure out how to make them work. And the thing is, when I need to be on tower frequency, I need to be on tower frequency right now. Not 5 seconds from now, right now. And so I bruised this thing because I hit it, and we all know that hitting our iPad harder is not going to make it work. But so I'm describing this to this audience of company people, a dozen company people and a dozen government people. And here's where Joe Dyer was prescient. He said, saying, hey, the suits are going to try and drive a wedge between the two of you. Is one of the suits, and by this I mean the corporate executives from St. Louis, says, yes, and I say, hey, this airplane cannot go to the fleet. This is a Friday afternoon in Pax River. This airplane cannot go to the fleet. We can't even let an OT pilot see this until this upfront control display is fixed. And one of the corporate guys says, yes, but what do the company pilots have to say? And Fred is kind of slouching in his chair and just kind of points at me and goes, exactly what he thinks.
Nice.
Yeah. And it was this, for me, again, we're now about 3-4 months after this gross blunder on my part in St. Louis. And, it was this ratification that Fred had forgiven me, and Fred was really eager to do exactly what Joe Dyer had told us to do, and that was we were going to have one pilot voice about what was good for the airplane and what wasn't. And and then Fred's and my relationship just continued to mature, and we just had this tremendous professional respect for one another. But it was easy for me to respect and revere Fred because of the passion that drove him was the quality of what we sent to the fleet. He was a Marine, a reservist. He'd commanded a Marine Hornet Reserve Squadron at Andrews. He'd flown A4s in the Marine Corps and had been a TPS instructor when he was still on active duty. But he cared a lot about the JO flying the airplane. And because that was his driving passion professionally, it was easy to be united with Fred.
Okay, so and you very humbly call it a failure, and that would be the government-only meeting. But obviously the results were kind of like you break a bone, right? You break a bone, okay, it hurts, but then it grows back stronger. So it sounds like your relationship obviously continued to flourish, and overall that just kind of fell into the background noise, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and that's well said there, Shine, in the sense that the relationship had to mend. And but then over the course of the next couple of years, part of just the intensity of what we were doing together was, that I don't know that Fred. Another funny story. I don't know that Fred and I were ever again on a different page.
Awesome.
Yeah. So one exception, and it's a good story. So Tom Gurney, my deputy, comes to me and goes, before first flight. I mean, before the sea trials, and goes, Knockers. Now, Gurn is, again, high-time Hornet pilot in the Navy. More shipboard landings than any pilot in the Navy. He's the carrier suit lead, and Frank Morley is his number 2. Gurns comes to me and says, I want to give the lieutenant the first landing at sea. I was like, ooh, that's
a big deal.
That's riskiest thing we're going to do in the program in the first year. And that was another goal, was you really want to get an Navy airplane. You want to get it to sea within the first year. And this is going to be January of 96. And I was like, ooh, okay. And we kind of kicked that around. I was like, I think that's a good idea. And so I go to Fred. Fred, Gurns and I think we should give Frank Morley the first landing at sea. And he's like, oh my gosh, we can't do that. I go, Fred, you came back from first flight and said the airplane was ready to go to sea after a 20-minute flight. Is it or is it not ready to go to sea? I said, and realized we also were fighting with inside the Navy. There was a lot of resistance from particularly the Tomcat community about, what makes it super. Just a lot of skepticism about whether Super Hornet was good for the Navy. And I go, Fred, what signal do we send to the skeptics if a lieutenant is in the airplane for the first landing at sea? And Fred kind of goes, ooh, yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, I think that's a good idea. So that was, even there, and of course, and Frank is now a 3-star in the Pentagon. So the Smoky Seas landing that you see of the first landing, that's, Lieutenant Frank Morley. And that was very intentional on our part because we believed the airplane was ready and that it wasn't risky, despite the fact that the winds were 40 knots. And he was essentially a trap and stuff because the weather was it was blowing snow and not an environment for flight tests. But so we trapped him and stuffed him. And there's some funny stories there too, but we probably don't have time for those.
That's okay.
But that's an example in which Fred's and my maturing relationship and trust with one another, where Fred trusted me, and we went with that, and that sent the signal that we really wanted to send. It was a lieutenant who had the first landing at sea, Frank Morley.
So you have this very cohesive, integrated test team, ITT, and you're working through technical challenges, programmatic challenges, as well as you're aligned on your strategic messaging, as evidenced by that sending the LT to the boat, right? The O3, if you will.
Yeah.
So with this integrated test stream, now that we better understand the personalities that go into it, so what were some of the design complications and deliberations, I guess, you guys had with the design?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of and little challenges that are showing up on every flight and early. So on my first flight in the airplane, we actually have 2 wing drops. So this is flight 6 of ship 1. Oh, I need to talk about the 7 airplanes. So we have 7 airplanes in the program. E1 is the Flutterbird. E2 is performance and propulsion. We do have a new engine, so it had to do a lot of propulsion tests. Fred and I shared E1 to start with. Later, it was Sandy and I. That was a Flutterbird. Ship 2 is performance and propulsion. That was Jim Sandberg and Tom Gurney. So one company guy, one Navy guy. E3 was the Loadsbird. That was Dave Desmond's airplane. So pretty much he did all the structurals testing in that airplane. E4 was the Spinbird, and that was shared by Fred and I. E5 was a weapons separation and avionics test aircraft. And then F1 was carrier suitability. So that was Tom Gurney and Frank Morley. So 2 Navy guys on that one. And then F2 was also an avionics test bed. By the way, the original program was not designed to produce anything but a 2-seat trainer. There was no plan when the contract was signed to have a tactical F. It was going to be an F for training only.
Gotcha.
Which changed before, between 95 and 99. By 97, it was clear that, okay, there's going to have to be a tactical F. But that was not part of our development program.
When you talk about E1, you talk about flutter, excuse me. So are we, finding the ragged edge of the flight envelope? What is flutter and what are we looking for?
Yeah, so flutter is a really complicated, think about a flag fluttering in the wind. Even apparently stiff structures, every structure will start to do that at some speed. And so the flutter speed determines the limit speed of an airplane. And, Fred originally did not want me flying flutter. He really, and this is where he was just being, he felt this ethical, and I do mean ethical, moral obligation that it was the contractor's responsibility to do the most dangerous testing. And when he finally acquiesced to allowing a Navy pilot to fly flutter, his comment to me was, spin testing wins you the Kenchlow Award. That's the, International Test Pilot of the Year. Flutter testing gets you killed. And that's because when things happen in flutter flight test, they happen at speeds typically beyond the ejection envelope. And so they are typically not a survivable accident. So flutter flight test, so ship 1, E1 was devoted to flutter, which is then painstakingly, you just, slowly increase the Mach number and the dynamic pressure flight by flight. Ultimately, much of it's flown beyond the maximum level flight speed. We have a maximum level flight speed in an airplane, and then you have the limit speed, V&E in a civilian airplane, or velocity never exceed. And so you spend a lot of time in the flutter airplane in dives trying to get to test points. In a 4-hour flutter mission, I might, because of so much time is spent in max afterburner and these steep dives at elevated Mach numbers, in a 4-hour flight, I would drain 2 C-130s, so 7 bags of gas.
So aerial refueling, obviously.
Yeah. We had 3 C-130s assigned to me.
So what, if you don't mind, what kind of dive profile? So you're a full grunt, you're an afterburner coming downhill. Do you remember roughly the max dive angle you were pursuing?
Typically in the 20 to 30 degree. Well, typically 20 to 30 degrees.
Gotcha.
And but a 4-hour flight with 7 full bags of gas, and we might come back with, in the test band, the test precision was really, really narrow. We might, so you might spin, and so 7 bags of gas, I might get 3 dives per bag of gas and each test band, I might get 10 to 15 seconds on condition.
Wow.
And so you're talking about a 4-hour flight and you're coming back with 2 to 3 minutes worth of data. And so a little bit about flutter flight test is that, because one of the things I knew you wanted to ask was satisfying flights. Is flutter flight test. One of the beauties was when I came back, I didn't have to write a report. I just had to say, okay, we hit the points. There was no qualitative, so I didn't have any much after action. But when you've got two tankers, a chase, an area that you're trying to manage, and you're trying to manage the time and the gasoline. And, we had days where as the team, so it's, just me and the airplane, but I'm on hot mic and there's 20 guys in the data station, guys and gals in the data station. And I got a chase pilot and I got two tankers. And man, if you had a day where you just were on as a team, and you just flowed right through things, and you knew that you used the area well and the time well and the gas well, and you came back with a couple minutes of data. That was just a wonderful team feeling. It just felt like a wonderful team win. There were points where Tom Clark was one of my tanker pilots, and he would listen to my hot mic, and he's in a C-130 doing 180, and I'm in a Hornet doing 500 plus. And I could get to my tank fuel state, and I would come off the point and go, point complete, tanker posit. And Tom would go, I'm your right 1 o'clock, 5 miles.
That's a great tanker pilot.
Yeah, and he would be lumbering up and down the test track in this C-130, listening to where I was, listening to where my fuel was, and then planning his trajectory so that when I would knock off a point, I could be aboard and in the basket in 2 to 3 minutes. It was awesome. I mean, the whole team is working like that. And we had so many days like that. And that was just this magnificent feeling where, you've got these 30 men and women who are working together to pull it all together. This is very, very expensive because we're spending these hours to come away with 2 to 3 minutes worth of data. And I love days like that coming back and landing.
I'm with you. So you have the test team firing on all cylinders, very well-oiled machine. But when you say capturing data, so are people watching you, taking pictures? Are there strain gauges? How's the data collected?
So every airplane, so each of those 5 airplanes I discussed was uniquely instrumented for the technical discipline that it was testing. So E1 had hundreds of strain gauges and accelerometers, all looking for these minute vibrations that would indicate were we operating safely or not. And what we did through the flight controls is we were actually we're deliberately vibrating surfaces and then looking how to see how the whole airplane would respond to an injected vibration. Sometimes it was 3 minutes long where we do a frequency sweep. Sometimes these are, little 3-second bursts at different frequencies into the ailerons, into the stabilators, into the rudders. Flutter flight test is painstakingly, essentially, nobody can fly to a flight condition, speed and altitude, until the flutter bird has been there first and cleared the point. Because flutter is the most dangerous of the disciplines. So typically on E1, it took us 18 months to clear the clean airplane. That's no wing stores, just with and without tip missiles. And typically what we would set up would be one day would be tip missiles on, the next day would be tip missiles off. So these are the AIM-9s. And then essentially the day that we're flying one configuration. St. Louis is analyzing the data from the prior day. So that would give them a day to look at our data from the previous day's flying and then essentially plan our next day's flights, what the points were. And so, that's 18 months to clear the clean airplane. Very painstaking little tiny Mach number increments to make sure that the airplane was safe. Then the VL dives, and I flew VL dives. Jim Sandberg and I each flew a VL dive flight. I flew tip missiles on, he flew tip missiles off, which is essentially confirming that the airplane is safe along the limit red line. Then the next 18 months, or the next 2 years really, we're clearing individual weapons loads, and those typically took 2 weeks of ground test and 4 weeks of flight test to clear each weapons load, going back to the same flight conditions we'd cleared for the clean airplane.
Hey, Knocker, excuse me. What is VL for VL dive, you said?
VL dive, so V limit. So in a civil airplane, that's called V and E, or the V never exceed. In the tactical world, we typically call it V limit. So that's in a Tomcat, that's 780 knots equivalent airspeed. In a Rhino, that's 720 knots equivalent airspeed. So the VL dives were essentially 50,000 feet out as fast as we could go in level flight, dump the nose to 45 degrees, and then essentially accelerate till you're on that right-hand envelope of the airplane as fast as it'll go. So it'll never be faster in a Rhino than we did on the VL dives. And then essentially riding that 720 knot equivalent line from, I might intersect it at, say, 26,000 feet. And these were rehearsed in the simulator repeatedly because they were really tight tolerances. So we did dozens of practice runs in the sim, and then kind of bailing out at 1,000 to 2,000 feet.
So would you say with these flutter flights, is this one of the times that you really felt like you were a test pilot and you were earning your pay?
Yeah. Well, again, because the flutter flight test was, my wife knew that I was flying E1 and E4, essentially the flutter bird and the spin bird. She thought the spin, she didn't want to know what airplane I was flying on any given day. She wanted to know if I was flying so she could pray for my safety that day. She did not want to know what airplane I was flying. She mistakenly believed the spin airplane was the dangerous airplane, but I was not going to correct her. E1 was actually the dangerous airplane because of the speeds we were operating. And, I had a couple of flights with apprehensions, going into the flight. And one of those was the VL dive, because I understood that if things go wrong in this, then I won't survive it. But I mean, we'd been really carefully, spent 18 months getting out to the point that we were doing those dives painstakingly. So.
Yeah. So all these are build-up approaches to the edge of the envelope, we'll call it, right?
Yeah.
And they're backed up by analytics. So your computational fluid dynamics and.
Yeah. And one of the things, and this will fit into when we get to wing drop, fit into it too, is the other thing we realized through the testing was the airplane was much better than we expected. That the flutter flight test program was supposed to be much larger than we ultimately flew. So we were able to cancel a lot of flights that were programmed for flutter because the airplane was actually better than designed. And essentially those extra flights were what paid for all the flights we had to use to fix wing drop. So that's how we could still finish on schedule. And that's because flutter was better than expected.
Okay, shifting gears to E4 now. So spin. So we talked about expanding or defining the envelope, we'll say, when it comes to the speed. How about spins? How were they? Were they easy, benign compared to the Charlie?
So Fred had done a fair amount of spin testing in the Charlie. I had done just essentially a handful of demo spins in the Charlie. Then we all did a T2 build up spin program in the E. Interesting. So Dave Sitz from McDonnell Douglas had led the Strike Eagle spin testing, and Dave's approach that he sold the government on for Super Hornet, he became our test conductor for E4, the Carnival airplane. It was the orange and white Carnival paint scheme. And that's because it takes good video. It's better for video, external video with the Carnival paint scheme, orange and white. Dave convinced everybody, okay, we go through this, we've got the simulator database, then we run all these simulation runs for different things that are going to happen. Dave believed that we needed to spin the airplane before we did departures. So we essentially did simple inputs first, then we spin the airplane. Because when we get to the aggravated inputs where we're expecting to depart the airplane from control flight, ultimately the airplane winds up in a spin. So Dave's premise was we want to spend lots of time, particularly with the pilots, but also the test team on the ground, training them to understand what do these things look like from strip charts perspective, so that when we get to aggravated inputs, we find ourselves, we're back in comfortable terrain. Oh, we're spinning. We know how this behaves. So again, Fred and I shared the spin bird E4, and it was pretty much, we just took turns. There weren't Navy points or government points. Yeah, it was a lot of fun and a lot of satisfying, and we saw a bunch of stuff that we weren't expecting. Kind of a funny story there was we were doing a inverted stall in F1. I had already spun the Rhino probably, 40, 50 times, the E model, which had a spin chute on it in case we blew. Oh, that was another thing on the E1 is we had a spin chute on the back of it so that if we blew the motors out, we could recover the airplane with the spin chute. And then Fred and I finished every E4 flight with a dead stick landing from 30,000 feet. So we pulled the throttles to idle, cracked the speed brakes, and we would essentially do we would rehearse an engine out landing from 30,000 feet at the end of every flight. So
wow.
High key was 12,000 feet. And then you put the gear down at 7,000 feet, and it's the space shuttle approach, this corkscrew approach from overhead. And then, you're coming down on final at 250 knots with the gear down in about a 20-degree dive, and then just rounding out and flaring the airplane onto runway 6 or runway 24.
Yeah.
Which was a lot of fun. Just this big sled ride. But so back to F1. The first day I go out for the F1, and this is kind of, okay, we're just going to do stalls, upright stalls, inverted stalls. And Jim Sandberg jumps in the back just because he'd not had any exposure to the high alpha program. And my upright stalls were unremarkable. Inverted stall, the first inverted stall, so essentially roll the airplane upside down, push forward on the stick, push. Bang, we're into an inverted spin. And recover the airplane, get it back. It's like, okay, well, that was not what the sim expected. We come back and land. I walk into my boss's office and I go, good news, bad news. I said, the good news is we started the F model spin program early. The bad news is it'll be a year before you sign the test plan. And what it was the wind tunnels. It was one of those dozen cases where the wind tunnels got things wrong. And, that extra long canopy in an F model is destabilizing directionally. And so that's what precipitated. And the wind tunnel essentially underestimated the influence that long canopy, the F model canopy on the directional stability when inverted at negative angles of attack.
So did you guys then notice, you said a couple times, where the wind tunnels kind of lied, we'll say, but did you notice a lot of times where the analytical predictions were incorrect?
So, I've got about a dozen of them that kind of, one is we haven't talked about wing drop yet. That'll be a longer conversation. There's this one flight where I had an inverted spin that just went really long. It took a long time to recover. Got the airplane back under control. My head is kind of messed up. And so I just said, hey, I'd like to calm down a little bit. Can we go to the tanker? So I go to the tanker, get another bag of gas. I come off and I'm better, but not altogether with it, and say, hey, do we have something really easy? Just do you have something simple for me? They go, oh yeah, let's go to card number 300 or point number 360. It's 0.6 Mach, 35,000 feet, stick straight to the corner. I go, okay, that sounds easy. What's the airplane supposed to do? It's going to pitch up and roll left. Okay, well, that sounds pretty easy. So 35,000 feet, 0.6 Mach, stick straight to the corner, 3, 2, 1, now. And the nose slices right, and I get a minus 4G departure. Oh. So personal record, minus 4Gs.
How painful is minus 4Gs?
It was momentary. Just my head hit the canopy on the video. My head hits the canopy and it's over. And I didn't know that my head hit the canopy until watching the video afterwards. The guys go, yeah, you overstressed the airplane. You need to bring it back. And so we came back and landed, and that was a case in which. So this is kind of an interesting anecdote for wind tunnels, and that was a case in which, again, John Hagan had seen in St. Louis had seen two different wind tunnel results that differed by 50% for the aileron effectiveness. And one of them, essentially there was the one value was really close to the Charlie value, and one was 50% greater. And John, kind of engineering judgment, goes, I've got these two differing results. I'll pick the one that's most like the Charlie. He should have picked the other one.
Picked the wrong 50%.
Yeah, he picked the wrong one. Yeah, and it's just engineering judgment. And what we wound up was the ailerons were more effective, and we fixed that in software. Now, that meant the high alpha program was suspended for a handful of weeks while we got a new software load to correct that. But we knew immediately what the issue was because of the data analysis is like, okay, the aileron's actually more effective than we thought it was going to be.
Gotcha. And when you had mentioned,
I got that wrong.
Gotcha. Sorry. When you had mentioned that, hey, we're going to switch to this card, it's more benign. So the cards, to provide a little context, right? So the pilots, you have your brief where you talk through what's going to happen that day. And then all the brief information is captured in kind of a playbook that's actually a series of cards that fit on your knee board, right?
Yeah, pretty much all I'm flying with in the airplane is this deck of maybe 20 to 30 5x8 cards that are on my knee board. And, we built the flexibility into the test plan so that when we got out on any given day and the weather was where we had a number of alternatives on a given day. where, if the weather was not cooperative or, we had a cloud deck at one where, we could we could do these cards usually for a given day. Now, from day to day, the order was scripted, but on any given day, we always took off with a deck of cards that was bigger than we could possibly accomplish, so that we, the test team, had the flexibility to go, there's a cloud deck at 10,000 feet, so let's go do this and we can go get this done, so that we'd have a productive day based upon weather. So yeah, it's a deck of 5x8, but I mean, because the airplane's flopping around all over the place, I'm not carrying a helmet bag. I'm not carrying, I had a PCL in my G suit pocket, but I don't have anything else in the airplane with me because of, what the airplane's going through.
That makes sense. And the PCL is obviously your pocket checklist.
Pocket
it's kind
checklist,
of your
yeah.
emergency reference manual, if you will.
Yeah.
So very pocket size, obviously. Okay, so we went through flutter, we went through spin, very dynamic evolutions in flight test, we'll say. But okay, so let's, if you don't mind, let's dive into wing drop.
Okay, so yeah. I mean, this is how many more hours are we going? My first flight this is flight 6 of ship 1 out of Pax River, and 35,000 feet, 0.9 Mach, and 2G turn to the left. So this is a pretty low dynamic pressure, but it is certainly transonic. And I feel this little, there's this little wiggle in the airplane laterally that I didn't do that. I told the data station, look, okay, there was something there and I go, we didn't see anything. I go, no, there was something there that I felt that I didn't do. Well, this proved to be then, the thing that nearly killed the airplane. Ultimately, I think I finished the program with 296 total flights in E's and F's. 105 of them were dedicated to fixing wing drop. So at first, as we got down to a little lower dynamic pressure, lower altitude, what we were finding is that in this range around 0.9 Mach, is that as you built the angle of attack and through, on the order of 7 to 8 degrees alpha, that we'd get this instantaneous 40-degree wing drop. Head ringing off the canopy kind of wing drop. And we couldn't, we weren't going to be able to do loads testing. We couldn't do anything, the low altitude where suddenly the airplane's bank angle changes by 40 degrees. And it was, the G onset rate was fast, you didn't feel it. You just went right through it. And the airplane was so glassy smooth above and below that. And we now really know why that was happening. And it had to do with the shock locations. The shock location on the wing was happy aft, it was happy forward. And when it moved between the two, it didn't move smoothly. It instantaneously would jump from one place to the other. And so it would do it on these separate wings. So you might be pulling symmetrically straight aft on the stick, but essentially the shock on the two wings was moving independently. And if they didn't move at the same time, you would get this huge roll moment that, again, about a 40 degree change in bank angle instantaneously.
And Knockers, when you talk about shock, you're talking about shock waves, right?
Yeah, essentially the shock waves on the top of the wing, as it's, when it's at 0.9 Mach, you're going to have a shock wave somewhere on the top of the wing because you're above the critical Mach number. And so it was happy forward, it was happy aft. And, later I got good enough where I could get the shocks to stabilize in one location, but, I'm doing a steady pull up at 4 Gs and I've got the stick half to the left. The stick's half left because the shock on the front on one wing is up at the forward location. The shock on the other wing is at the backwards location. I got this huge asymmetric roll moment on the airplane, despite the fact that it's a straight pull up.
Okay, so if you don't mind, so when you say that you're managing the shock waves and you get them happy in a certain area, are you able to look out and see them based on atmospherics?
No, they're largely transparent. Some days you might have a high humidity day. And we do have some photos and some videos on high humidity days where you could see the fact that the wing, and these were challenging pictures to get because of the speeds and the G levels, where the wings are clearly have a different flow pattern on the two wings. But this just really, again, so I found it in March of 96 with my first flight. We kind of dabbled. We found a quick fix in software with the leading edge flaps in mid 96. We made the mistake of telling people that was the 80% solution because we were able to eliminate most of the drop, but the 80% of the work was not done. We still were, they're just, we put together these blue ribbon panels. We called together all the transonic experts in the country, which was actually a problem in 1990 because what we learned was the transonic expertise in the United States was either dead or retired.
Wow.
The people that had done all the transonic research of the 50s, 60s into the 70s had all either passed away or had retired, and no transonic work was really done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we brought back a bunch of people from retirement. We're gluing all kinds of crazy stuff on the airplane. There was one day I can remember we've got mahogany tripper strips from an Amish carpenter in Mechanicsville glued all over the airplane. And, I flew a flight and it was pretty good and came back and I'm in the fuel pits and our maintenance guys are on the wing with a mallet and a chisel knocking mahogany off the airplane while the engines are turning in the fuel pits. And I'm thinking, oh, please, please, please don't damage the wing. And we go back out and we glued sandpaper. We glued one Ricardo Traven called the Ben-Hur configuration where he had all these Vortilons glued all over the airplane. And we tried tripper strips and sandpaper on the leading edge. We were just trying all this Band-Aid stuff, just grasping at straws, trying to find something that would eliminate wing drop.
So they always talk about modeling and simulation using the fancy high-tech math, we'll call it, to diagnose, to figure out, and then hopefully to resolve. But it sounds like this was literally fly, fix, fly. Is that a good way to put it?
Oh my gosh, it was awful. I mean, and one of the funny ones, and I wish I could draw a picture for you, but we were showing at one point in time what's the lift curve slope look like? And folks showed this nice smooth line. This nice smooth, the engineer showed us this nice smooth line of the variation of lift with angle of attack at transonic speeds. And I go, well, yeah, but where's the data? Show us where's the data. And then they showed us the data, and there was essentially all these data points along the line at down at low alpha, and then all the data points along the line at high alpha. And we asked, why isn't there any data here at around 7 to 9 degrees alpha? I go, oh, the model was bouncing around too much in the wind tunnel to take any data.
Oh,
like, oh, really? Guess what? So's the airplane.
Would have been good to know.
Yeah. And later, after Super Hornet was in the fleet, we actually had a really big study to better understand what had happened to Super Hornet. And particularly, they were concerned about, how do we make sure that we don't wind up in the same place with F-35? Now really understand well what happened on Super Hornet and created some methodologies. This is 2003, 2004, 2005, created some methodologies to improve the modeling of these kind of phenomena. And the Super Hornet was not the first. Most transonic airplanes had seen this. It had, the Band-Aids, the fences and things like that you see on, MiG-15s, MiG-19s, MiG-17s, that on A4s, Harriers. They were all essentially Band-Aids that people were put on to try to fix wing drop as seen in these other transonic airplanes. But there were some tools that were created then about 20 years ago to try to do a better job to predict it. And that's probably a path we don't want to go down. But, the program's in extremis. We've got an airplane now, this 96, 97, that's clearly unacceptable from a flying qualities perspective. It's hitting all of its other targets, but the thing is the wing is just so poorly behaved that the airplane is unsatisfactory. So this is creating a tremendous amount of pressure in the team. We're pretty much flying almost every Saturday. And here's where I'm going to take it that your audience is also interested in leadership issues. My boss, Bob Wirt, challenging person to work for, very demanding. He describes himself as, I could be volatile. But Bert did a wonderful job of caring for the team. He was a senior commander at that point. I was a junior commander. He put his foot down and said, this is the 7 most expensive airplanes in naval aviation. We are not flying Sundays. This is a 4-year campaign. We're going to not wear these people out. And he also said, at the beginning of the year, I'm going to publish a Saturday a month that we are not flying so that people can plan for weekend activities. And, and he put his foot down with captains and admirals and said, this is how we're flying. I have to take care of these people for the long haul, the long game. And, captains and admirals said, okay, Bert, whatever you say. Bert also put his foot down with, stay out of my building. If you have questions for me, we'll come to you. He goes, but I don't want captains and admirals showing up in my building because if you show up, work stops. So Call me with your questions and I'll come to you. His leadership gave him the latitude to set the conditions under which we were going to work. And Bert, we did fly 2 Sundays during the program, once the week before we went to the ship for sea trials. And then another one was where we just got slammed by weather and got slammed by weather for a week and wound up flying on a Sunday.
So the culture that he fostered, if you will, through what's the actions you and communications you just described, really helped the team to flourish, and I would say also to help you guys to figure out these problems in a timely manner.
So Bert was magnificent at protecting the leadership, the team from these external influences and external pressures. Another situation, and it has to do with that one Sunday we flew because the weather broke and we had a Saturday, we flew on a Sunday. And then the next 5 days we were flying, and I was flying this is all during the wing drop campaign. We're trying to fix wing drop. This is December of 97. I go out on Friday, so this is the 7th day of flying in a row, and with expecting to be out for a 3-hour mission. And my head's just not in it. Normally, I can situation myself in the area where I am, where the airplane state is, where my tanker is, where the chase is. I can keep and balance all that in my mind and visualize where everyone is and where I am relative to a tight airspace. And this Friday morning, this is right before Christmas, because I couldn't. My head was just not around things. I couldn't keep track of myself, let alone where everyone else was. And we got about 20 minutes and got offshore. This is off the eastern shore of Delaware near Wallops. And I'm maybe 10, 15 minutes into the test flights. And I just go, okay, guys, I can't. I'm done physically. And we need to knock it off. And we came back, I park and I go right to Bert's office. And I tell him, I go, I just didn't have it mentally. I couldn't do this today. And Bert goes, you're right. We're done. Not only are we done, he goes, we're canceling the rest of the flight schedule for today, and we're canceling Saturday's flight schedule. He goes, this team needs rest. And I walk into the debrief, and one of the engineer goes, oh, by the way, knockers, if you're tired, it may have something to do with the fact that you've flown 245 wind-up turns to 7.5 Gs in the last 6 days. I go, that might be it. That might be it. Yeah. So ultimately, wing drop, and so here's where Ricardo Traven comes in. So Ricardo was a Canadian Air Force pilot flying Hornets. He'd worked for me before we came to Super Hornet. He gets out of the Canadian Forces. I encourage Fred to hire Ricardo. Ricardo is just one of the most imaginative, creative, funny, just brilliant guy. I frequently, if I'm on a stage, I'll ask Ricardo to give a paper with me because I just know, I'll be interesting and accurate, and Ricardo will make it funny and imaginative, and he's just wonderful. So, and everybody's saying, oh yeah, his security clearances, they'll transfer over. There'll be no issue. Well, Boeing, by this time it's Boeing. Boeing hires Ricardo, and no, his security clearances don't transfer. So Ricardo spends about 3 months where he's not allowed to look inside the cockpit. But he's in the building, he's in the office, he's listening to everything, and he's attending the briefs. And Ricardo comes with he goes, I think it has something to do with that wing fold. He goes, I think we need to take the wing fold fairing off. And we've got all these NASA blue ribbon committees and panels, and it's like we're trying one thing after another, and we are grasping at straws. And it finally comes down to, we have run out of ideas. Let's try the crazy Canadians idea. So we take the wing fold fairing off, and lo and behold, there's no wing drop. So this is where the wing folds for flight deck storage. So the wing folds up 90 degrees, and where the fold is, there's a panel that's about, maybe 9 inches wide by, 4 to 5 feet long, that folds down to close over the hinge on the top. The hinge is open on the bottom, but it's closed on the top by this panel. And so we go flying with the panel off. And there's no wing drop. Gone. Now, what there is a whole lot of buffet. So now we know how to solve wing drop, but we have introduced a lot of buffet on the airplane. And so now we're in a buffet reduction program because, the buffet's just absolutely unacceptable. And what we ultimately, and this is over the course of January to March in 98 now, January to March, we're in a buffet reduction program where we're cycling through different panels, trying to figure out how to get rid of wing drop and buffet at the same time. And what the Rhino has currently is a perforated panel on that wing fold. So when the wing folds up, that panel's sticking up vertically. That panel has 30 mil, 60 mil, 90 mil holes from leading to trailing edge that allow air to flow up through the hinge at transonic speeds. And it essentially breaks the inboard shock from the inner wing shock from the outer wing shock so that they can't talk to one another. I described it as a pneumatic fence, though others have resisted that description. But I considered it a pneumatic fence. And one of the beauties was it had no effect on the range or the performance in any domain. It got rid of wing drop. There was still this vestige of buffet, a little bit of buffet that I didn't like, but you've flown Rhinos, a Rhino pilot doesn't even notice it until you fly. And the thing is, and we were still able to keep on track schedule-wise. We now had a path by which we could finish the program on time, on budget, and get the airplane delivered. And so every Rhino pilot flying owes a debt to Fred Madmol for the ferocity with which he fought for the quality of the airplane. And that we were able to fix wing drop is attributable to Ricardo Traven, this Canadian pilot who was on our team. Yeah, that was awesome. Now, sequel to that story, and there's one more thing about wing drop we need to talk about the sequel to that story is once the pressure was off, we went into a better examination of wing drop on Rhinos to figure out, is there a better solution that gets rid of the buffet and wing drop? The answer is yes. It's a fence along the upper part of the wing. They tried, this is called the Transonic Flying Qualities Improvement Program, and it flew 2000, 2001, 2002. Ultimately, it was decided that the Rhino was okay. We can live with the buffet, but the Growler can't. And so the Growler has that fix, has the fence and the change to the leading edge snag. We could refit that to Rhinos, but the program, both the Navy, the fleet and the program manager decided, there's other things we'd rather spend the money on because people aren't complaining about the buffet. But in the case of the Growler, because of hot electronics on the wingtip, the buffet intensity needed to be reduced to protect the durability of those components. And so the Growler has the final fix, which is the fence and the change in the snag. And there's a bunch of Rhino pilots who don't know the background, but where that stuff came from.
No, I'm learning as we speak. So
yeah. Now, one other thing that before we get off of wing drop, actually kind of two. One is the freedom we had as a team. This comes from, I ran into one day to Admiral Jeff Cook, who is our program executive officer, to whom we reported. So he's my boss's boss's boss. And I came back from a flight. I'm sweaty and stinky. I'm in an exposure suit, and I've got it tied around my waist, and so I'm in a t-shirt, half undressed, and I run into the Admiral. Like, this is fine military bearing here, Commander. But Jeff asked me. He goes, "Knockers, is this really as bad as you say it is?" And I kind of explained, "Yes, sir. That here's the issues and here's the implications, and we cannot let the fleet see this. It's just absolutely unacceptable." And then Jeff told me, "It's fixed when you say it's fixed and no one else." And instead of pressure, that was actually liberating for me. It meant that the company was not going to make the decision. The program office, the captain at the program office, my boss was not going to make the decision. The Admiral was not going to overrule me. And it was simply, it was the Admiral going, when you decide we're fixed, it's fixed, but not before that. And it was just this freedom I felt where I had this top cover from the 2-star who was going to protect my judgment.
So just a good news story of empowerment, huh?
Oh, golly, that felt wonderful. And I wish I'd asked the question earlier, but now it's just this really rich professional memory of leadership who trusted me. Now, later there was a debate about, do we cave on wing drop and rush the thing to the fleet due to program pressure? And I had to tell those people asking the question, I said, yeah, I was under pressure to call wing drop fixed. My wife would ask me routinely, have you fixed wing drop yet? Because she wanted me home on a Saturday. So yes, I had pressure to call wing drop fixed, but it wasn't from the program. The program gave me the latitude, the program specifically through Admiral Cook gave me the latitude to do the right thing for the fleet. And and youngsters like yourself, Shine, who've flown the airplane in combat. That's my reward of having been involved with this wonderful group of people for 4 years, and then to see the product get to the fleet and perform so well. We were on time, we were on budget, we were underweight when we delivered on May 1st of '99. And then to see, all of you who've flown the airplane on and off of ships at sea and come back safely, both from that crew, both from that flight, but also from that cruise and fly the airplane in battle. That's just a profound reward to have been involved, to have the chance to be involved with that.
Yeah, and I can tell you, Knockers. Oh, sorry, just flying combat. Charlie's in combat, and then Echo's in combat. Yeah, thank you to the team. I mean, thank you. So something as simple as coming back with more fuel for a night landing on the carrier, just the less stress I had. I feel if I had stayed in Chucks the whole time, I would have. I wouldn't look as young as I potentially do right now. A lot more wrinkles, a lot more gray, maybe bald at this point. But because of the Echo, just life was just still very challenging, but just less complicated, less stressful.
Yeah. Now, okay, so we got to answer the question about the canted pylons.
Yeah, please.
Because that's the one that nags every Rhino pilot. It's like, yeah, these doggone canted pylons. All right. So let's see. We're flying. It's mid-'86. We've got probably 3 or 4 of the airplanes flying by this point of the 7. It's mid-'86. And the wind tunnels are predicting that when you release heavy stores from the inboard station, that they're going to yaw nose out, and the tail fins are going to hit the cheek-mounted FLIR and targeting pods on the cheek stations. Okay. And so that's a wind. So this is another case of the wind tunnel line. And I was in the room for this, and I need where there's about 20 different fixes that are proposed, and they kind of get winnowed down to 5, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff that's being contemplated for fixes to make sure that the bomb, when you drop the bomb goes away, that the bomb does not hit the airplane. And and ultimately we're in the room, and the group, there's about 20 of us in the room, led by Joe Dyer, Captain Dyer, who's the program manager, and where we settle on canted pylons. So a brief aside about Joe Dyer and his leadership style. Wow, when I don't know anybody who so much as Joe Dyer, who knows how to promote dissent. He would go around the room, and he wanted when it looked like a decision was being crystallized, and that includes canted pylon. He would go around the room and ask everyone their opinion. And it wasn't, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. He wanted to hear everyone's analysis. He goes, this is a big deal. I want to hear absolutely everyone's analysis of how they feel. And if you disagreed with the forming consensus, Joe Dyer would turn the volume up on you. He wanted to hear more. If you disagreed with his perspective, he wanted to hear from you more, not less. And then he would circle back afterwards and tell you how much he valued your dissent, the minority opinion. And that promoted a liberty. If the baby was ugly, Joe Dyer wanted to know it. And he culturally promoted this atmosphere in which it was, not only was it acceptable to disagree with the skipper, he wanted your disagreement. And really believed that the best decisions were going to come out of that intense sort of debate and deliberation. And that was wonderful to work in that. And canted pylons was one of those decisions where this is tough. Okay. So the idea behind the canted pylons is if we tow out the pylons, then we put a preload on the tail of a bomb. And when the bomb releases from the airplane, instead of yawing nose out and the tail hitting the airplane, if you preload it by moving the tail in, now what will happen is when the bomb's released is in that fraction of a second after release, it'll actually nose in towards the airplane, yawing the tails away from the fuselage. That was the idea. So that's the idea. And the projections were, the local flow at the inboard station is actually about 2 degrees outboard to inboard. So what we're doing is we're taking the weapon and it's got this outboard to inboard flow. We're actually turning it 2 degrees the other side. So it's a 4-degree change. We're towing it 2 degrees the other side to preload the tails the opposite direction. But we're actually not changing the local angle of attack on this pylon very much. And in fact, Boeing, assessed and ultimately in flight tests proved out there was a spec. It was the combat range in the interdiction 3 loading. That's 3 drop tanks, 4 Mark 83s, was I think 482 miles. Boeing still beat that number. They still got a bonus for beating that number. That was in the contract, millions of dollars of bonus for beating that number. Towing the pylons out, Rhino pilots, the effect on their range and endurance is actually not nearly as much as they think it is. It just cut a couple of miles off that range and endurance. It's not the huge. Now it looks awful, to be sure, but it's not a nearly as bad an effect as they think it is. It's it costs them maybe 1% of their range.
Okay, and,
right.
and that 1% would be when you have external fuel tanks on the canted.
Yeah, so this was
pylon.
INT3, so 3 tanks, interdiction 3 loading. That's 3 drop tanks, 3 drop tanks, and then Mark 83 is on midboard and outboard station. And again, it's about a 4-mile penalty that you pay for the cannon mile, but out of a 500-mile nominal range. So it's not that much. It looks awful. Greg accepted. Okay, context. So back to, again, we were in a program to save naval aviation. And $4.88 billion, not a day longer, not a dollar more. On 15 November 86, I had an engine blow up on me during a flutter flight test. So settling into 105 Mach, 2,000 feet, going up the test track near Wallops, and settling into the point, and then I felt like I went over a speed bump. And the first thought through my mind was, I ran over something. It's like, no, wait a second, I'm at 2,000 feet. I didn't run over anything. And then kind of pull the throttles back. It's like, okay, that's kind of weird. Brought the throttles back up. Engine left. Okay, pull the throttles back. Data, what do we got? They go, we don't know. We don't see anything wrong other than the engine left light. It's like, okay, should I put it down at Wallops? And I go, no, bring it home. And so the left engine at idle, I come back and I land kind of single engine back at PAX. I don't remember if I took a trap or not. I may have. And we open the engine up, and the engine looks like the dental records of a hockey player. I mean, there's just one of the compressor blades went and just essentially took out everything downstream of it. Still ran it idle, so I still had hydraulics and electrical from it. But so now the program is grounded 8 weeks before our first ship trip. And GE very quickly found the culprit. It was a slight manufacturing change to the compressor. But it's going to take 6 weeks. We got 8 weeks to get to the ship. It's going to take 6 weeks to get the fix in, to fix 2 or 3 engines for the airplane that's going to go to the ship. And the program manager is looking at this and he's going, not a dollar over, not a day late. We had not yet collected flight data to confirm whether or not the canted pylons were necessary. And he knew that if we went to the canted pylons, it was going to take 4 to 5 weeks to do the change on each of our airplanes. And so he's looking at a fleet of 7 grounded airplanes that are going to do nothing for the next 6 weeks. He's got a mod that's going to take 5 weeks that's already going to be hurt his schedule. We don't have the data that we know the canted pylons will work, but we don't yet know, are they really necessary? And Joe Dyer decides, execute. And so we mod all the airplanes then in November and December of 1986, or 96, while the airplanes are down for this engine failure that I had. And so now canted pylons are baked into the airplane. All of the flutter testing, all the loads testing is going to be done with the canted pylons. And to go back is a couple of years of flight test, of structures flight test, because the fix is now baked in the airplane. So now later we find out it was probably not necessary, that the WEP-SEP, again, wind tunnel lied, or misled us. It's a little harsh on the aerodynamicists to say the wind tunnel lied. The wind tunnel results misled us, or it was probably unnecessary, but it was not as detrimental as every Rhino pilot suspects, going back is way more expensive, would have been way, way, way more expensive. Again, we were out to save naval aviation. And we might like a mulligan on that one, but when you look at the context of what the pressure Joe Dyer was under in 1996, his mission was to save naval aviation. And so canted pylons, small cost.
Very interesting, Knocker. I never knew the whole story. A lot of the fleet, the Rhino fleet, doesn't know the whole story.
No,
You're right.
I'm sure.
We stand on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier and we see guys coming in at least double bubble with the, let's say it's accentuated, right? Just because of the orientation of the external fuel tanks there. Yeah. We always gripe, but to hear that it's 4 nautical miles out of 500, so less than 1%, just inconsequential. But when you look at the causal factor analysis and you say, if we had removed the engine failure, things may have been different.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apart from the grounding, but do you want a reliable engine or not? I mean, it's good that the engine failed. I mean, it's good that I had that failure.
Absolutely.
Because we found something out about those engines really early in the program that we were able to, which is why you do developmental flight test. And so, you youngsters can fuss all you want to about the canted pylons, but those of us who were there, it's like, hey, listen, okay, we'd like a do-over on that one thing, but look at all the other things. I mean, you could be flying F-14s that are still bandaged together, like the Air Force is flying together bandaged F-15s. Instead, you're flying a new airplane because Joe Dyer and the team that he led was successful at getting the airplane on time, under budget, under weight. Yeah.
And
where
nailed
else?
it.
Where else is that done in DoD?
No, I'm with you, and I don't want to. Sling mud at anybody for this, but
no.
So as they say, the proverbial bitching sailor is a happy sailor, right? There we go. There are so few issues that the Rhino pilots have with the Rhino that they gotta wank about something, right? So they have to pick the canted pylons because everything else is I thought was epic. You know what I'm saying? So it's a very minor detail.
Yeah.
So
and we've gone really long here, but there's another conversation perhaps about PLM and the Magic Carpet that's pretty interesting. And I think I'm working on the sequel program right now for ILM for the E2. Where that program came from. I was on the periphery. Kind of bit player, Buddy Denham and Joe Renfro are the two guys that every Rhino pilot should be celebrating as a consequence of what they accomplished. So I was so proud this year at Hook when Mike Heller got his award at Hook. Now, the vast majority of Rhino pilots have no idea who Mike is, but Mike was a flight dynamicist controls guy in St. Louis, McDonnell Douglas, then Boeing, and he's the one who's responsible for beta dot feedback and the features that went into Rhinos that we test. Mike had long had these ideas that I think I can fix the out of control flight problem in legacies. We were losing a Tomcat a year and a Legacy a year to out of control flight, typically falling leaf in the legacies. Mike had an idea to fix it. And so from 2001 on, when we finally, then beta dot was so successful that it got mapped back into legacies with flight control load 10.7 around 2003-ish. And since 01, 0 out-of-control flight losses in the Rhino Growler community.
Epic. Absolutely epic. And hey, real quickly.
From one a year to 0. And it's all because of Mike Heller. And this year with Mike Heller's retirement, we were able to get Mike an award from Hook. Mike Heller bought the Navy $1 billion in Hornets.
Isn't that amazing? And what is beta dot?
Yeah, it was some things that Mike did in the flight control laws of Rhinos that then got mapped into Legacy that essentially eliminated falling leaf, eliminated spins from the airplane, and allowed folks flying the airplane to go flying and fly the airplane without abandon, without concern for the out of control flight losses that were so typical in the Tomcats and the Legacy airplanes before Mike's work came to play. Yeah, so to get Mike the credit and the visibility that he deserved was really, really satisfying.
Gotcha. So when I think of angle of attack, I think of alpha. When I think of side slip, right, I think of beta.
Yeah.
And then beta dot's going to be the change of the side slip. So basically
Yeah.
being not oriented correctly to go through what do you call it, trim flight, I guess, basically. So, okay, just for the listeners. Yeah. Nice. Okay, so here you are, Knockers, and I'm gonna throw some sunshine your way, if you will. But I mean, PhD, test pilot, chief test pilot for this fantastic program. I don't want to call it legacy to mix it up with the legacy Hornet, but anyway, just you're currently a professor at the Naval Academy, just motivating the young mids, specifically in the aerospace engineering department. So, what lessons, whether it be life lessons, leadership lessons, family lessons, do you still carry forward from your days of developmental test?
So, I'll tell, when students are looking at studying with us, one of my common things that I'll tell them is, my job today is to play Yoda to their Luke. I've got hair growing out of my ears. My contributions, my tangible contributions to naval aviation are way behind me. That was the 90s, the 80s and 90s. My job is to play. These young folks, they're the ones who are writing an adventure. They're coming to the Naval Academy and they're a little naive to they're idealistic, but they're naive to the severity of the world in which they're about to go. And like Yoda, who had to kind of calibrate Luke to the challenges he was going to have in front of him. He was going to have to drive him to some places that Luke perhaps didn't want to go. And so, I tell young folks coming to us that's my role, is to set high expectations, to challenge you, to nurture you, so that you're ready for the challenges that face you beyond graduation when you get to the fleet. So, yeah, it's a fantastic privilege that I've had for the past 20 years and so to do that.
And the Reader Digest version of your course descriptions will say for the firsties or the seniors, if you will, those guys are flying, right? They're actually doing some handling qualities evaluations.
Yeah. We this is what we use the Baron for is flying qualities and performance testing, and the airplane's down right now because I hit a bird the week before Thanksgiving or Christmas with it. But we're doing flying qualities and performance testing. I had a great flight with a firstie, really good student in November, and we're just doing simple stalls and accelerated stalls. But the look on his face told me that was not what he was expecting. And I asked him, I said, so was that more dramatic or less dramatic? And this is essentially a 1G forward level stall. I go, was that more dramatic than you were expecting or less dramatic? And we've only talked about stall 5 semesters at this point for him. And he goes, well, no, that was actually not at all as I was imagining. That was more dramatic than I was expecting. It's like, okay, that's interesting. It just underscores the value of me getting them into an airplane and actually seeing these phenomena that we've talked about, short period and phugoid and damping and all these dynamic behaviors, what the influence of flaps is. They've seen it in the wind tunnel, and they've seen it in books, and they've seen videos on YouTube, but actually to get in the airplane and to feel it, there's something different about the visceral feel of how the airplane behaves that's just fantastically rewarding. And we have a very generous grad who funds that effort so that we're able to get mids into an airplane and fly with them in the context of their engineering education. I'm not teaching them how to fly. I'm trying to help them understand the technology that makes flight feasible.
Nice. Any other parting shots for the listeners regards to flight test?
We've spent a long time here. This is, it's really rewarding. Now I've kind of transitioned. Certainly the 80s and 90s, my focus was on the airplanes. In the last 20 some odd years has been focusing on people. So airplanes are my context, but I'm actually in the people business, and growing young people who want to go do this at the pointy end of the spear is my privilege, and watch them develop. I've now been at this long enough that students of mine are commanding officers. The test squadrons down at Pax River are largely students of mine. CEO of the Blue Angels now is a student of mine. So that's what's profoundly cool, is to be involved in these people. Airplanes are really the context in which I get to work.
Nice.
Thanks for listening to episode 1 of Test Pilot, an authentic production.